we started, sorry, with a discussion of this map in particular. One of our subcommittees, the Urban Design Subcommittee that was formed during the discussion about the new uh, master plan for downtown, it started talking about all of these underdeveloped lots, all of the parking lots that are downtown, in combination with the fact that there's always a discussion about how Anchorage doesn't have enough buildable land. So we were trying to figure out, if there isn't enough buildable land, but we have all of these empty lots in downtown Anchorage, what exactly is going on? And in addition to that, with the drive towards more an increase in housing downtown, how much housing and how many square feet of development could we actually fit on these lots? So we started talking about this map and talking about the zoning in downtown, what sort of code exists downtown currently, and then the proposed downtown districts, the land use plan map for downtown in the draft master plan, and how those two things are, how, first of all, the code downtown that exists as is impacting the development of land downtown, and then how that might interact with these new districts, and some of the guidelines that are will be in place once that map is adopted. So Christine asked us to start in on this study where we took all of these different things that are impacting development downtown, the code, the potential district maps, and also we briefly considered seismic conditions downtown, but ended up not using the seismic map as a guide for development, because we felt that was a health safety issue. And even if there were impacts from the seismic map, we didn't feel like there would be any changes recommended based on the fact that it's not a good idea to build in seismic zones if you're not going to appropriately adjust your structure and your use for those seismic zones. So we looked at the by right development, uh, the total square feet of development that you can fit on some of these lots downtown, just based on what exists in Title 21 at the moment. And in Title 21, there are all sorts of different factors playing into the zoning code. There's a bonus table in the code that, where if you want to develop downtown and you want to build a tall structure, then you go through this bonus table and you find all of these amenities that you provide in order to get additional square footage in your structure and additional stories. There's a tower, a bulk tower limit that will allow you to build these square towers downtown, but not anything that is more conducive to a thinner, long rectangular building, which is what is preferred for residential development. And then a few other factors in the downtown code, like restricted uses that we found. And we pulled all of that together along with the downtown district land use map allowances, and sort of studied how those two, the allowed square footage, the maximum lot capacity of these lots downtown, and what might be allowed in the downtown district land use plan overlay, and how those two interacted in order to come up with a maximum build out number for these lots. So this study was based on two sizes of lots. We have very small lots downtown that are about 7,000 square feet each. So we took one of those from each zoning district and overlay, so that if you have, for example, a 7,000 square foot lot in Denali View, which is the overlay, and it also happens to be in B2C. We looked at that lot to discover exactly what the maximum build out was on that lot. And then we also picked one from the B2B zoning in Denali View just to see how that might impact the numbers. And we did the same for these basically half block sized lots as well, because there were different factors impacting the numbers on the lots depending on the size. For example, on a very small lot, it's very unlikely that you would want to build structured parking. So let's see. So we built this very very complicated table that I won't go into at the moment in order to find out what these pressure points were in the code and in the downtown land use map, and came up with a list of recommendations based on these discoveries in the code itself. And the list included several recommendations for changes to the land use code downtown, as well as a couple changes to the draft land use map and some of the overlay districts. So the biggest recommendation that we were making was to get rid of this bulk tower requirement, where it was hampering the form of these buildings downtown. So at the moment, it's great to build downtown if you want to build a tall, square office building. But trying to build residential downtown is a lot more difficult because there are requirements for residential, for light, basically daylighting in the units, and you don't want to necessarily build a large square tower for those types of buildings. So our first recommendation was to move away from this bulk tower requirement and possibly explore a different alternative such as FAR or solar step backs to maintain the integrity of the pedestrian environment at the base of the towers, but also allow for more variety in the form of these buildings. These are existing buildings downtown, and you can see that they definitely conform to this bulk tower, but there aren't any good examples of buildings like this downtown that have been built recently that allow for the residential development. Another recommendation we made was to move away from the bonus table, because we felt that the bonus table was actually a limiting factor in development downtown for several reasons. The first of which was that it encourages the development of parking structures over anything else. So if you wanted additional square footage and additional stories in your building, if you're building a tall tower, then you were required to build quite a lot of structured parking or provide parking of some sort on your lot in order to get that square footage. So it heavily favored building parking. And that is and in the discussion of the parking lots downtown, there was a study a few years ago that the results of the study basically said that downtown is overparked at the moment by quite a bit. So parking is not necessarily a priority for the downtown at the moment. Not to say that people couldn't provide it, but this bonus table definitely heavily favored parking over any of the other amenities. Um, it also was self-limiting in some ways. Some of these amenities that it was calling for in order to gain extra stories would require the developer to shrink the footprint of the building. And in doing so, you're hitting the maximum height limit, the maximum story limit for these different districts and zones that much faster. So it was definitely self-limiting in that respect. And some of the other discoveries included uh, the fact that the downtown code in some areas actually does not permit strictly residential buildings. So we were taking a look at this in specifically in regards to residential development, and in the downtown core, you cannot build a residential tower or residential building without some sort of commercial on the ground floor. And then we also discovered that in the overlay, the district overlays, there was a maximum dwellings per unit out laid out for some of the districts, and that maximum was extremely low for an urban core. So we made a recommendation to remove that from the draft plan, which I think Christine has already done. So that's, I think, a summary of most of our discoveries during this study. And Christine or Holly, did you have anything else that you might want to add to that?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Melissa. Great job. I just want to say one quick thing about this study that they did. We, based on the methodology that we have used in the past, I asked a different consultant who was doing some mapping for us for the downtown area if he would do an estimate of how many housing units that would be capable using this buildable lot map. And he came up with, well, on this older methodology that we've been using, and he came up and he said, well, we could probably have around 1,200 new housing units. After Bettisworth North did all of this work, we found out that we could have potentially over 5,000 new housing units downtown, changing the code and getting rid of the bonus point system. And like Melissa said, in that proposed land use map that's with the downtown district plan that's going to the assembly, we actually eliminated any dwelling units per acre and any height limitation in that land use plan map. And we'll let the code guide how tall buildings are going to be and the recommendation for dwelling units per acre. So really this study went a long way to bring a lot more housing downtown than we could have if we would have kept going and doing the same things that the 2007 downtown plan did. So this was a phenomenal study that these folks did, and we really appreciate this new data that we have and that we're going to be able to share with the community.
And this is Shannon, if I can just jump into, I think we wanted this presentation to this group, for those who are on this call today, it's great to see more of the banking folks online. Our developers maybe are missing a little bit today, but part of what we're trying to do is connect all these dots. This focus has really been on the financing, but it's all tied to what you can actually build and what the code allows and whether or not it enables the kind of things we're talking about. So we just wanted this group to understand that work is happening, and it's really bringing forward some really great changes to make make the code work for housing downtown. It doesn't necessarily change the pro forma, but if we can work on the financial piece, then the two can come together and we can really start to see the housing develop.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add something. This is really encouraging for me to see. And again, I'm kind of an outsider coming in with a California perspective. I think it's really exciting to see kind of a perspective of thinking bigger in terms of adding more units, because when you get hung up on the pro forma side of it, it's, you're looking in a vacuum, but it's also, you've got to remember as a developer choosing projects to spend time, money, and resources on, you're one piece within a larger context, and there's a synergy that affects things. And if there's more growth, then it opens up more opportunities. I personally came into Anchorage seeing something that reminded me, and this process continues to I see parallels, and it's a different demographic, different weather, and et cetera. But I see similarities with Santa Monica, California, which has really transformed itself from a rough, scrappy urban environment, and it's really transformed itself in a very positive way with a lot of density. And one of the things they've done is they've kind of turned the parking requirement upside down, where it used to be, you know, if you're going to go in and do residential units, you have to provide at least so many parking spaces. So kind of like, 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per unit. And now they've actually turned it upside down and said you cannot provide any more than, say, half a unit or half a parking space per unit. And it's really made a vibrant, pedestrian-oriented thing. And I see, you know, obviously Anchorage isn't Santa Monica, and it's not going to end up exactly the same. But I do think there are elements that do transfer from that kind of atmosphere and environment towards this. And so hearing, you know, going from 1,200 units to 5,000 units really is positive in my mind. As long as we're also thinking, you know, people can move to a kind of a live, work, play kind of a concept where we're also making sure there's enough office and recreation, you know, kind of, I'll say, personal amenities, fitness and restaurants and all that. So if this is one part, and I'll say this may be the most crucial part of moving towards that end. So again, it's kudos to all. This is really positive from my perspective.
Oh, you're on mute, Holly.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from any of the members before we move along?
Oh, Holly, I just wanted to say one quick thing. It looks like Ryan Strong had to drop off. We are recording the meeting, so we'll make that available, that link available for folks once it's posted, so that you all can watch it again if you want to.
Okay, go ahead, Shanna.
Great. And thanks, David, for your comments. We will kind of narrow back into the pro forma for just a little bit, and then we'll go back again to the more of the policy and the broader goals of why we're here with some case study research that Katie prepared. But I did want to give everybody an update on the pro forma. Really, since we last met, the main things that we did were so that the pro forma model allows you to kind of pick between 5 different sites in Anchorage and see what the feasibility issues and the potential incentives can do to impact that feasibility. If you remember, that was part of a citywide process to look at the transit supported and workforce housing property tax incentive. So there was only one downtown site. So what we wanted to do was integrate our work into the work that Bettesworth North was doing and add a couple of more downtown sites. And these are still a work in progress in terms of assumptions, but really what we have now is our regular downtown example, which is that 40 units on a half acre that we have been looking at for the last couple of months, really an 80 unit per acre density, getting us to about $120,000 per unit gap. And then you can see as the 12-year tax incentive gets layered in, which it currently allows for, the gap decreases by almost half. And then if you add in that patient capital and the land write down, you kind of totally get rid of that financing gap. The final third column is where we are kind of taking a more of a serious look at that 25-year property tax incentive that doesn't currently exist, and then kind of matching that with some kind of other additional incentive that might be needed, like a smaller land write down or some support around infrastructure. And so you can see that also as an option to improve the financing gap as well. So the other 2 sites we added were block 102 at 8th and the Park Strip, and then block 28 at West 3rd and H Street. And the way the model is set up right now, the gap per unit comes down slightly. I don't know if I would buy into that totally, because I think at the number of units we're thinking in this location, we probably would need to adjust the construction costs up a little bit more. And right now it mainly assumes that 40% of parking is on site through a surface parking arrangement, with the remaining being met through either adjacent parking structures or shared parking arrangements. So there's really nothing in there for structured parking. But we can also easily adjust that in the model and take a look at what happens. You can see again, the 12-year tax incentive improves the gap, and then we've kind of held the $2 million patient capital amount constant, as opposed to offering it as a per unit amount. And so that with the larger projects, you don't see it improving the feasibility quite so much. And then that third option with the 25-year tax incentive really helps the project. So, I mean, this is just like one snapshot of all the different assumptions, but now what's nice is we can kind of look at these two sites downtown in addition to the smaller site and see how the incentives can really make a difference. Katie in our office prepared this graphic. It's just if you're more of a visual person, and as we prepare the report that will go forward, again, just looking at the gap per unit, the current incentive structure getting you about halfway through there. And then there's kind of two options on the table in my mind, really trying to find the source of capital for a patient capital fund and marrying that with a 12-year tax incentive, or putting that on pause and really looking to extend the tax incentive out to 25 years. And so I think that's really the fork in the road for our community right now, if we want to see this kind of housing built. Okay, any questions before I dive into some of the subcommittee updates? And I have the pro forma if anybody wants to look at it. Well, we can maybe send it back out now that we have these other sites in there. It's also set up to include, if you want to adjust the percentage of parking that's surface versus structured. So that all kind of clicks in when you make those adjustments as well.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. For the land write down, what's the assumption being used there? Is all of the land being written down to zero? I mean, how's that working?
For this middle one, it's all of it. So you're doing a $2 million patient capital loan with the land being written down. So it's really a model that kind of tries to replicate the one that Sean Debenham shared for 8th and K, where the land might be publicly owned and maybe have a 99-year lease, and then the payback for the patient capital comes in through the long-term lease. For the 25 years, it really depends on the assumptions for the project. I think it was more like 20% land write down. And again, it's there's really two options. If you have land that's owned by a public agency that's willing to put it out to market or enter into a long-term lease to make this happen, you have a lot more flexibility. If it's a privately owned property, there may still need to be some funding set aside for redevelopment and for land assembly and for partial land write downs to make the landowner willing to engage, which is what typically happens in communities across the country through tax increment financing. We don't have that. But there still could be a way to, provide maybe not the patient capital fund, but some focus on land assembly and what that actually means. A third option is some landowners in our downtown who've been landowners for many years, may be interested in also a similar arrangement where they're partnering with a developer over a long-term lease. But it is really challenging to make these project pencil if you have to pay $75 a land square foot for the sites downtown and north of that.
James, go ahead.
Yeah, question. So do we have any sort of general terms for what the patient capital would look like in terms of interest rate, payback, things like that? Because when I think about, proposing an additional 13 years of, tax abatement versus patient capital being a piece of that, the tax abatement, that's going to be, money lost for 13 years, but the patient capital would have, a delayed payoff, but it would still be, positive cash flow. So
That's a great question. I'm just going to address it when we went to the subcommittee, but I'll start now. So as our patient capital subcommittee met, we did open up the pro forma and took a look at the final worksheet. If anybody's looked in that model and gotten all the way through, there's the last tab that is the discounted cash flow, and it allows you to set your terms for the patient capital provider. And so what I was doing was playing around with a negotiated approach that looked at like a 3% patient capital term amortized over, I think, 30 years, with repayment on day one, but not at the full amortized amount. So it's kind of the residual cash flow after paying the debt service to the bank and the equity investor. I also set it so the equity investor not getting the threshold returns at year one, more like 6 to 8%, which may or may not be okay with the developer. But I was looking at it again from some experiences we've had in other communities where, you know, both sides are having to compromise to get these funding mechanisms in place. But what was nice is that you're right, it does offer, you know, payment even as early as year one, but just not the fully amortized amount. The interesting thing about the pro forma is because of the 12-year tax incentive, year 13 actually needs some help when the taxes get put back in. So there's a little bit of up and down there. But the challenge is we have to find a funder who's willing to capitalize that patient capital fund. And so far we haven't been able to find that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shanna, do you want to move in and move to the next slide and talk about the results?
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we just go there? And if we need to come back to that pro forma, we're happy to do that.
Yeah.
But since we are flirting with this patient capital discussion, let's just go there.
Yeah, so this is the two subcommittee meetings we had since we all met as a larger group in December. Patient capital included Sean, Alan from ADA, Mark from HFC, who's on the call today, myself, Christine, and Holly. Like I just mentioned, we did do the deep dive into the pro forma and looked at that repayment option. We discussed different return measures to the private industry and how that gets measured. You know, I think for the most part, we heard that it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, for the state agencies to offer the patient capital, either due to statutory limitations or just the way that the funding is already being used. We did hear a little bit about a possible solution that ADA and HFC are collaborating on in Fairbanks to address multifamily and housing demand near Eielson. And that was in the early stages of being discussed as a model where ADA could take on more of a developer role to get the land ready and the infrastructure built, with HFC offering their financing that they have for that housing. I might ask Mark if he has any updates on that, or if you guys, I know that was still going to the ADA board and Alan's not here today, but.
Yeah, it did go to the ADA board and they okayed it moving forward. So I think the ADA staff is kind of trying to, you know, fill in the blanks and kind of get a general game plan on, you know, how to move forward. The project involved, you know, the North Pole City buying some land up there, and I don't know where they're at that point, but it's all kind of contingent on that parcel becoming available. But I mean, the structure will be there, you know, whether the land is there or not. But I think this particular project is contingent on the North Pole City buying the acreage, which, by the way, is like massively cheap.
Yeah.
And so they have an advantage that no one else will ever have in other parts of the state. So
not 75 larger land square foot. Yeah, and you know what the opportunity there is, there's a federal designation as a military facility zone that allows for, you know, more ability to be creative about how to provide solutions. The military demand is not the focus of downtown. It's part of our community, but it's not the driver. But there's a different set of public objectives around revitalization and redevelopment, and our downtown plan spells that out. So what's nice about this example is maybe it sets the stage for maybe not the patient capital fund that we are dreaming of, but some type of arrangement to support the infrastructure. Maybe it's the parking side, maybe it is part of the land assembly piece as well, which could really help. And then we also brainstormed a possible role of foundations. I think when I shared the repayment to the patient capital funder at 3%, it may not work for the state financing agencies, but it's still more of a repayment than, say, for example, Rasmussen receives on the grants they offer. But aligning the place-based redevelopment strategy with the larger goals of the foundations is really tricky. And so I think it's worth having that on the back burner or having some initial conversations. I think the challenge with what we're trying to do is build that market rate housing that's not income restricted and not luxury. And so to the extent that we start to bring in organizations who maybe have a focus on, targeted affordable housing for certain income limits, then you have the opposite impact to the pro forma that the rents are even lower. And so it just becomes challenging. But I did like that we were thinking out about those ideas, and I want to keep them on our list as well. Any other thoughts on that subcommittee from those who participated? Okay. We had a small group for the property tax incentive and land assembly. It was Greg Sorbana from Widener, myself, and Christine. And really, we just did the same thing I talked about a second ago, where we looked at the pro forma and modeled the benefits of the extended 25-year tax incentive if no patient capital was available. We really talked about prioritizing that, we're talking about new incentives and adding to the toolbox, but we have to make sure that we advocate to extend the existing 12-year property tax incentive beyond the 2024 sunset. I think when it was approved, we thought there would be more opportunities to use the incentive, but with the combination of COVID and that the tax incentive at 12 years only gets you about halfway through the gap, it needs to kind of stay on the books for longer. And then adding the East Downtown Fairview tax abatement zone also to that 2024 sunset request. We spent quite a bit of time on the land assembly side talking about the benefit of moving these key parcels out to development and what Block 102, if there's an opportunity to bring that out to market as an RFP with more clarity on the incentive structure, which could be really great. And then Christine had shared some property assembly methods from other areas, and we talked a little bit about the C-PACE option as well. I don't know, Christine, do you want to add to that, particularly on those last couple of bullets?
Yeah, thanks, Shanna. So we did research, some of us are members of the American Planning Association, and we looked at any background information that they had for land assembly methods. We've got a couple of different papers that talk about it. One is kind of like the private one where the muni or a housing authority would engage a variety of property owners. They would become part of this LLC. They would get shares in the development along with the developer that was going to develop the project. And, some of you may have heard of that in other areas. And then there's the public one where the public completely drives it. They get folks to sell their properties so that they can assemble a larger parcel and then move it forward that way. I think when we get ready to finalize our report for the assembly and for the administration, we're probably going to propose the ability to use both of those methods. A lot of the lots downtown are very small and owned by a lot of different people, but then there are some larger lots that are only owned by one private property owner. And then we're looking to find out if we can stack that C-PACE on top of a 12-year or a 25-year property tax incentive. And if we can stack that, then that will help us get green buildings in downtown which will help reduce the overall cost to developers, folks that move into these apartment buildings, things like that. So folks are on vacation right now, so I haven't been able to get a response back on that CPACE, but that could be an exciting thing too. And I just wanted to say that the property tax incentive and land assembly, Adam was part of that subcommittee
Oh, right.
too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, any questions about what we discussed?
I have a question for Christine. Just curious, that idea of stacking a CPACE on top of a property tax abatement, have you seen that done anywhere else? Because I'm just curious how that would work if you're abating the taxes and the CPACE requires you pay taxes or an assessment, how that kind of counterbalances itself, or I'm just curious if you've seen that used somewhere other places.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Mark. Shayna, who's the expert on this, is out of town until next week. So I wanted to get into an in-depth discussion with her and find out what her experiences have been, if any, at this, at this point. If we haven't done that within the MOA, which I don't think we have, then we'll go ahead and look to other areas that have adopted the CPACE and see how that's working out. And just so any folks, if you don't know, the CPACE goes with the property. It doesn't go with the landowner. So if somebody sells a property, that CPACE carries forward with the property, and that's how that's done. And it's a lot more complicated than just this short discussion. So anyway, yeah, we'll look into that, Mark, to know for sure.
And then on the other two methodologies that you mentioned, where you it sounds kind of like a community real estate trust, a REIT, where people invest money into a larger thing for a larger project. Is that kind of similar to a real estate trust?
Yes, essentially with the private one, where they would create an LLC, the private property owner would become a partner in the development. They would be issued shares based on what the land is worth. And so they would become a partner with the developer, potentially with the municipality, if the municipality is like doing the infrastructure upgrades and things like that. But for the most part, that private one doesn't have a muni or a city involved. And so that's basically a large investment that a key group would do together. The public one is more where a public agency, say ACDA or Munis HLB, would go in and buy smaller lots, put them together, and then they would make the partnership with a developer and move it forward that way. And the muni would have, or the city would have, a lot more investment into that. So kind of what we're doing in the pro forma with the tax incentive and that kind of thing.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay. Should I keep going? Yep. Let's see. Okay. So basically that middle part of our discussion was to kind of give you all an update on the pro forma, and then talk about the details that we've all had on these separate subcommittee meetings. And then part of our scope of work in 2022 is really to help think through this notion of a housing target for downtown. And if you remember, when we got together in November, we had a conversation about what that means. And we also heard Christine say earlier that we could probably fit 5,000 units in downtown. And then we also hear a lot of discussion about, well, what's the market demand for downtown? And we have some surveys that show demand. But it's what we're learning from other communities is that really there's this policy choice and this leadership choice to say, these are the number of units that we want downtown to help revitalize and make it vibrant. And so we've really put some time and effort into a framework for that. So, how much housing, what strategies do we want to deploy? And really the purpose of this work is reaffirming that connection between downtown housing and downtown revitalization as a goal. and then sharing best practices around that particular topic. I'm going to have Katie Skovic do most of this section because she's been doing a lot of the research. But just to frame it up a little bit more, her research kind of gives you a process for going through and looking at these approaches. And really, again, we've already kind of finished that first one where we have a general understanding of the downtown housing demand through the surveys and through just the knowledge of people wanting choices downtown. We've spent a lot of time, at least I have spent a lot of time on pro forma, so we really know what that gap looks like. And it's the next 3, 4, and 5 bullets that we really want to focus on. So go ahead, Katie, take it away.
Shanna, and hi everyone. I was excited to hear David say he was glad we were thinking big, because here we go on this section of our conversation today. I think, as Shanna mentioned, when we look across examples from other cities, this sort of loose process that's outlined here rises to the surface for how we can think about catalyzing downtown housing development. And so, as Shanna mentioned, with that first step, we know from AEDC surveys and kind of other tools that there's a baseline level of interest in living downtown. And as I'll talk a bit more later, this, when we look at other examples, is kind of a sufficient baseline understanding. And these examples kind of highlight for us that it's important not to get too caught up in specifically quantifying demand beyond that kind of initial baseline understanding. As Shanna mentioned, she and a lot of folks have spent a lot of time on the second step. And so where we really want to focus today is on steps 3 through 5. So looking at setting a specific medium-term goal for downtown housing development in Anchorage, then looking to identify and implement incentive programs that address the gaps that we see and ultimately help us reach that goal. And then this 5th step that we see, kind of the most visible housing goals in other communities, are those that are championed by local leaders. And this idea here is that these are big efforts that really take a collective group pointing in the same direction. And so I think we can dive into the next slide here, Shanna. And so, yeah, this is the process that rises to the surface when we look at both existing research on best practices and then the case study research that we've done. This report on the left is one of the tools we looked at that I found really useful in just really building that connection between downtown housing and downtown revitalization. The idea being that we won't have a vibrant downtown until we have more folks living in it. And that kind of just leads us directly into downtown housing as a solution for downtown revitalization. And if we go to the next slide here, really taken together, what the case studies and literature point to is this initial shift in thinking that Shanna mentioned. I think it's natural for us to start by asking, what is the demand for downtown housing today? Or how many people actually want to live downtown? What types of units do they want? And what we see in these other places is that what we really need to do is start by thinking about supply. So rather than trying to measure current demand for downtown housing exactly, which can be low or hard to quantify when there aren't sort of tangible downtown housing options for folks to visualize themselves in, we should start by thinking about supply. And I really like this quote from the Wichita, Kansas master plan. So there's been consistent demand for downtown housing since more has become available. And the idea here is that by focusing on supply, which is really what we can affect, we can kind of create or unleash the sort of latent demand for downtown housing that we believe to be there, and we can sort of meet and see rise to the surface by starting to focus on the supply side. And that APA report has this has a section in it as well that really talks about, while local governments can't necessarily create demand for downtown housing, they can affect the supply side of the equation. And so the idea there is that focusing on supply is also focusing on what we can affect. And so that's just this sort of shift in thinking that is kind of a foundation for the approach we lay out in the report that we'll be sending out and in these next couple of slides. And so many of the cities that we look at have organized their downtown housing efforts around a specific medium-term housing goal. So most of those look like a specific number of units over about a 5 to 7 year period. And we started here in this table by looking at similarly sized cities in terms of population. And this is the handful of cities where we found a published or kind of publicized housing goal. And you'll see these range in kind of the 1,000 units, 1,500 units, 1,800 units. And we did a quick calculation to look at how many on average downtown units per 1,000 people that broke out to. And if you exclude the outliers, what you get for Anchorage is about 1,400 new downtown housing units. And so this was just for us to start getting a sense of what other cities have done and what that might look like in Anchorage. I think in some ways that might just sort of sound like a number and it's not totally clear what it means. And you might be wondering why we would use something like this or why it's helpful. And I think for me, what was clear looking at other cities is that these numbers are very much about building downtown housing units, but they're also about sort of setting a vision and expressing confidence and commitment to downtown. And as we'll get to towards the end, kind of gives people something tangible to orient themselves around and talk about and sort of build that collective will and commitment to a downtown area. And so I think it's both, it's a tangible goal and it's also sort of helps create a vision. And I just wanted to quickly highlight, I think something that illustrates this well is the example from Boise. So in 2014, Boise set a goal to develop 1,000 new units by 2020. And I stumbled upon this news article, which I thought was great. And basically as 2020 was approaching, Boise had 850 units either completed or in development. So technically they came up short of their goal, but they also had 850 more downtown housing units than when they started. And they really credited that for kickstarting the effort. And that downtown housing effort there has just kind of snowballed from there. And they're now considering sort of single projects with 500 plus units proposed within them. And so very much thinking about, I think, the housing goal as part of a vision and kind of a catalyst for getting started. So I think this next slide here, in many ways, obviously setting the housing goal, kind of picking a number is kind of the easy part, and the meeting the goal is the hard part. And I think you all are very aware of that. We also know that the market today isn't incentivizing downtown housing in Anchorage on its own. I think the good news for me in looking at other places is that's actually to be expected. And so as we look at best practices, as we look across examples, it becomes clear that early public investment is often necessary to spur early private development in a downtown area as part of this kind of downtown reinvestment. And that especially was true in that report I showed earlier about the kind of small to mid-sized cities. And so this is something that we see and isn't a specific problem to us, if that sort of helps us feel better about facing the problem. And Shanna walked through these examples earlier, so I don't want to spend too much time in the weeds of them, but I did want to just highlight at the bottom here, we did some case study research. These are just a few pulled. There will be some more information in the kind of full report, but in Boise, for instance, we saw the use of direct cash incentives for downtown housing. In Reno, there's a proposed sort of massive 20 block development effort that's very much a public-private effort that's leaned heavily on pretty large land write-downs. When we look at Corpus Christi, I think we see maybe the most common example where the city has developed kind of a toolbox of incentives. So that includes financial incentives, parking considerations, reduced land costs, trying to kind of layer on the various incentives to spur development. And I think this graphic here is just meant to show what that kind of toolbox or layering approach could look like here in Anchorage. And again, Shanna kind of walked through this. So it's this initial option to fill a large bulk of the finance gap that we see, then also making sure that we keep in mind that also includes layering in other considerations like parking support, land, et cetera. And so I think we've, yeah, I was gonna, if you want to jump in, Shanna.
I was just gonna add, like, I think that the detailed work that we haven't done, although it's not hard mathematically, it's tying this with the target in terms of like an overall budget for our program for the incentives. And so, again, if we are moving away from patient capital, but still looking for some resources to help with land assembly, you can also start to create different buckets of that 1,400. Maybe the first 300 has a more robust incentive package, and it's all the funding that we could find. And so we lay that out and make it clear to developers, start now, and here's the full incentive package. We don't have resources are identified after unit 301 or something. I mean, there's a lot of different ideas that could go into something like that. So that's just, I guess, food for thought as we think about next steps.
David, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Holly.
Go ahead. David, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I didn't know if it was the appropriate time, but I'm gonna.
It's okay. If it gets too long, I'll move it along.
No, and I'll make it, these ones are fast points. The first one kind of takes a step back, and it's, are we considering the average unit size per project married up with the land in the context of institutional money wanting 200 plus units? It's kind of that threshold of operating efficiency. So if they're over 200 units, you'll attract more development interest. So if we can focus towards that, it's a good thing to build in now rather than after the fact. Second thing is the point of, and then Katie, I think you nailed it. Excuse me. I want to emphasize that changing the character of the environment will definitely increase the demand. I learned it early in my career from a guy named Jeff Palmer, one of LA's biggest apartment complex developers. And he always phrased it as, look, I don't care. I can go into the roughest neighborhood, the worst place. And if I have a large enough project, it comes with, it basically creates its own environment. So that will drive demand kind of despite things. So I think when we start, that will be a factor in a positive way, is new projects will start to boost things and drive demand. Another point was to make sure we're not limiting the demand to kind of traditional housing thinking. We have a lot of pilots. We have a lot of people who come in. Myself, I'm coming in from California. I still have a home in California and kind of bounce back and forth. And so for me, when I first landed here, trying to find something, that fits what I was looking for in more of a condo or something, this kind of the projects we're talking about would have been perfect. And I wasn't able to find it. So I think there's actually a shortage for people who are multi-locational that kind of feed into demand more than just a single family. We want a typical house or a typical apartment, in a suburban kind of complex. There's more demand for, or I'll say, I think it's very possible that it would be easy to underestimate the demand for these type of downtown units. And then the last one is, to Shauna's point, money tends to chase deals that are proven. And so pioneering is tough, but once it gets started and people see that a project is successful, then the markets will chase those deals. And so what I'm trying to do is reiterate the importance of kickstarting this or front loading it, knowing that it'll start to get some momentum on its own. And so using more resources sooner, front loading it, will really jumpstart it. And I think there's a definite rationale to try and go heavy up front along those lines. And those are my points.
Thanks, David.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Katie.
I think I'm about to turn it over to Shanna, but I appreciate that point, David. And I think the last thing I wanted to say on the housing goal front is that I think the most helpful version of that is if it really does get us to kind of coalesce around a vision and it spurs development. I think if that number feels too big or we don't have that buy-in, it could do the opposite and make it feel hard to get started. And I really like your point, and I really like Shanna's point about what is the goal within the goal? Is there a smaller number of units that we're really just trying to hit more immediately? And we know that the public investment into that will be higher. And what you do see in other places is ideally you have like those lines cross where the public investment starts high and it gets lower as private investment grows and sees the model built out and proven out. So I just wanted to leave with that really the idea here is to find something specific to coalesce around and kind of have that vision piece. And I think that's maybe a good transition over to you, Shanna, because I think this last piece is really about how we do that.
Yeah, I mean, the local leaders to champion
Holly,
downtown.
Shanna, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, definitely.
David, really appreciate your points, but I just want to remind people that this process that we're going through right now, it's because we're updating the downtown plan. But literally in 2016, that's when our jumpstart came. So in 2016, Oklahoma City came here. They said, focus the effort. Smart Growth America came here. They said, focus the effort. We started doing that. That's how we got Elizabeth Place. That's how we got Dukes. So Elizabeth Place, brand new housing, and then Dukes, it was a remodel of an existing historic building. We've got Sean's project going now. That's the patient capital one where ACDA is making that investment. And then Sean received the 12-year 4 housing unit tax abatement. We've got the 6th Avenue garage that's in the works. It's been going on for a few years, but they've got their agreements in place, the assemblies behind it, and ACDA is working with Larry Cash and his group to make that one happen. That's hotel and housing, which is a good project. So we're actually in motion. The ideas of bringing you all in was predicated on the plan update and how we can keep it moving with the tax abatements getting ready to sunset in 2024. So having you all involved with us, and for those of you folks that are in the banking community, we're moving on this, and this is basically the next big step. And I just want to make sure folks know that there are positive things happening in downtown.
Just real quickly, forgive me for being relatively new to Anchorage. And I've seen some of those, but thank you for putting in that context.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, Christine. And I think, when we started the conversation in November and we had Sean walk through 8th and K and saw how the tools that he's accessing, actually make that project pencil, that's the first 40 units, right? And then the 6th Avenue garage the project has different economics with the hotel piece, which is also great. And so then, really we're just talking about like, how do we replicate that and how do we create the resources for the next number of units? But again, the gap is high. So when we start to look at even 1,000 more units or 1,400 more units, with it maybe becomes trickier versus setting an initial budget for the next 200 or something like that, or timeline. But those are great ideas. So before I pass it back to Christine to kind of talk about next steps and where we're at, just highlighting this last pillar of the research that Katie did was that local champion and leaders. And we've all been talking about this, and AEDC has been a leader on this topic for years when it comes to live, work, play housing and other initiatives. I think really what's most sort of prominent is that target number and feeling like we can coalesce around a number, and then we can all be talking about that as our goal and our objective. So I don't know, Katie, did you have more to add from the research on this piece?
I think just to Christine's point, which I really appreciate, I think this is also about sort of championing and talking about the work that is happening. It's all just about sort of building that momentum. And I think that was a really helpful reminder, is it's not sort of starting from scratch by any means. It's saying there is development happening downtown. We have a vision for how we get to more housing downtown. And I think that's really what this last piece is about. And that was a good reminder, I think, on that. And I think that was about it, Shanna, just other than to say that this was really clear in all of those examples we looked at, was both a really specific number. It's easy to repeat. It's easy for people to sort of understand. That feels tangible, like we are actually building towards a number. And then hearing it from a lot of different leader voices sitting in a lot of different seats in the community is just an important piece of getting the word out.
I'd just like to add one comment, and that is, don't forget rehab. You know, there's a lot of low-rise buildings downtown. There's a lot of you know, kind of buildings that probably could be renovated into housing, and you know, people always, I think, traditionally have thought that rehab can be more expensive than new construction, but that's not always the case. You know, you might be able to achieve the goal a lot faster if, you know, there's as much emphasis on rehab as on new construction.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the redevelopment of the parcels that are underutilized to add more housing, and then the rehab of the existing structures is super important too. And what's nice, I think, is bringing in the CPACE option for some of that rehab could potentially be helpful. Yeah, so I think that's a great point, Mark. Okay. Christine, do you want to talk about where we are with next steps? I think that was the last slide we had.
Sure, yeah. So again, thank you everybody for being here today. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate all the work that our team has done. I've said this in the past at other public meetings that the Muni has been so fortunate to have this dream team that's been working for us with all the years of experience that they have, and the use of the code, and, you know, trying to help financing happen here in town. It's me personally, I've just really appreciated everything that Holly and Shanna and Melissa and all the team has done. What we're going to do, Katie alluded to a report. We will be publishing a report, and we will be taking that report to the assembly and to the administration. It will have recommendations in that report from staff and from our team. We're not going to say, oh, all this group of people came together and they recommended this. Alan was a little bit worried about that at a past meeting, and the recommendations moving forward are going to be from the team. And we are definitely going to acknowledge, though, that you all that participated helped us see different aspects more clearly, and helped us come up, not helped us make the recommendations, but help us determine what recommendations needed to be made. I'm not quite sure how soon we'll have that report done, probably in about the next month. And because we're doing a couple of exciting things other than this process. We did kick off the downtown code update about a week and a half ago. And so we're working on that. We've got a working group on that part of it. And then me personally, I'm moving forward with the assembly to have them adopt the downtown plan update. And like I said, there's been some edits to that based on the work that Bettisworth North did as far as that land use plan map and some other things in there go. So if any of you are willing and able and want to send an email of support for the downtown plan update, we would really appreciate that. You could send that to me, or you could send that to your assembly member. If you haven't seen the plan, the package is on the assembly work site, or their assembly page. And then you can also find the plan without the suggested edits on the Our Downtown Anchorage aka.com website. If you guys have any ideas after we leave here, any thoughts, please be sure and shoot us an email, because we'd be happy to hear it. And we're just looking forward to really bringing this forward, talking about our successes since 2016, and then what we need to keep this train moving in the right direction, especially since COVID hit us and everything else. We're in a interesting position right now in Anchorage and in Alaska in this time and place. So appreciate everything. And yeah, if anybody has any other thoughts, please let us know.
Any final words? Okay, I think we're done. I appreciate everyone's participation. We have a lot of gratitude for it. We know it's a lot of time and energy, but you're the leaders in the community that Katie keeps referring to.
Mhm.
So thank you very much. All right. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Hi, everyone.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.